Today I'm going to show you an action-adventure film from 2018, titled Outlaw King. Be ready for spoilers ahead. The film begins with a voiceover, following the death of the Scottish king in 1304, with no direct heir to the throne. The Scottish lords appointed King Edward I of England to help choose for them a successor. However, King Edward instead seized power and brutally occupied Scotland. The Scots, led by Sir William Wallace, rebelled. However, their rebellion faced defeat at Falkirk, and Sir William Wallace fled into hiding. All resistance crushed and faced with limited options, several Scottish lords, including Robert Bruce and John Comyn, reluctantly pledged loyalty to King Edward as he laid siege to Stirling, the last castle in Scottish hands. Their confiscated lands during the rebellion were returned. Then King Edward established a new Scottish administration led by a viceroy, under which Robert and John agreed to serve. The sealing of the treaty between the Scots and Edward I was marked by launching Greek fire at a nearby castle and the English accepting the fortress's surrender at the evening feast. In a bid to secure favor, the king arranged for Robert to marry Elizabeth de Burgh, an Irish noblewoman with ties to King Edward. Robert reluctantly accepted the proposal, influenced by his father's belief that gaining the king's favor was crucial. However, upon reaching home, Robert and his father grapple with the consequences of their submission to English authority. Soon, Elizabeth arrives, and their official marriage with Robert takes place, but out of respect, Robert postpones its consummation. One evening, Robert's father reminisces about his past, recounting stories from his days fighting alongside King Edward in the Crusades. Despite initially seeing Edward as a friend, he expresses regret for placing trust in him. Shortly after this, Robert's father passes away, making Robert the new Lord of Annandale. After 1 year in 1305, Robert and his men journey to the border city of Berk to deliver owed taxes to England, where they get caught in a crowd gathered at the marketplace to witness the aftermath of William Wallace's capture, his severed arm displayed after being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Chaos erupts as the people protest, and the English soldiers start attacking Scottish civilians defending themselves. Robert witnesses the brutality and horror but decides not to intervene. Returning home, Robert shares the news of Wallace's execution with his brothers, reigniting his determination to resist English rule once more. Elizabeth, who overhears their conversation, agrees with their stance. Robert meets with Comyn in a church to seek his support. However, their exchange becomes tense when Comyn reveals his intention to inform King Edward about Robert's plans. Robert unsheathes Comyn's blade from his belt, plunging it into his neck, swiftly ending his life at the altar. Later, Robert admits the killing to the Scottish clergy. In exchange for supporting the Catholic Church in Scotland, they promise him absolution and aid in becoming the King of Scotland, leading the nation against England. Accepting the proposition, Robert prepares to be crowned in the English village of Scone. Amidst celebrations and battle preparations in a nearby forest, Robert and Elizabeth share a quiet, intimate moment, consummating their marriage. King Edward learns of Comyn's death and Robert's impending coronation, sparking his rage. Prince Edward II implores his father for a chance to prove himself by capturing or killing Robert. Reluctantly, the king agrees. Meanwhile, Robert rallies Scottish nobles, seeking their support for a renewed bid for independence. While some nobles back his cause, Comyn's supporters resist joining him. En route to Scone, Robert encounters James Douglas, who wants to strike a deal with him. Douglas pledges allegiance in return for reclaiming his family's lands and titles. King Edward knights hundreds of men led by de Valence under the dragon's banner set for confrontation. During the night, as Robert and Elizabeth put their daughter Marjorie to bed, Robert urges Elizabeth to safeguard their daughter regardless of his fate. Suddenly, strange noises outside their tent interrupt the night's peace. Robert investigates the area, discovering a barrage of fire arrows descending upon the Scottish camp. De Valence leads an attack under cover of darkness, catching the Scots off guard. Amidst the English assault, Robert entrusts his brother Neil with escorting Elizabeth and the daughter to Culdrummond Castle for safety under Lord Fraser's protection, a trusted friend and ally. Despite valiant resistance, Robert faces an inevitable defeat. With roughly 50 surviving men, battered and desperate, he flees the battlefield. Beaten and bloodied, Robert and his remaining men wander the Scottish countryside, opting to seek refuge on the home islands of his ally, hoping to bolster their depleted forces along the way. Robert's group encounters John MacDougall, who harbors bitterness over Comyn's murder and allows them to pass without harm. Meanwhile, Neil brings Elizabeth and Marjorie to Lord Fraser's castle, offering respite from the escalating turmoil caused by Robert's coronation. While crossing a river, Robert and his men fall into an ambush orchestrated by the MacDougalls. In the skirmish, Robert's brother Alexander falls victim to a spear, his body left behind as the Outlaw King's forces dwindle further. Eventually reaching the islands, the remaining soldiers recuperate and garner additional support from those willing to join their cause. In contrast, King Edward's son carves a brutal path through Scotland, ruthlessly eliminating Robert's supporters, pillaging towns, and capturing villages, including Robert's castle. Upon arriving in Perth, Prince Edward reprimands de Valence for failing to apprehend the outlaw and expresses displeasure with his incompetence in tracking him down. Shortly after, a loyal Scottish nobleman arrives and discloses the whereabouts of Elizabeth and Marjorie to the English. In response, the prince mobilizes his men to confront Lord Fraser at Kildrummy. At the castle, Prince Edward demands the surrender of Robert's wife and daughter, threatening an attack if Lord Fraser refuses, but Fraser feigns ignorance about their location. Neil covertly guides Elizabeth and Marjorie outside the walls, advising them to seek refuge in the forest until he can arrange for their protection and safe passage. Amidst a rain of fire arrows into the castle, Lord Fraser, under pressure, offers to open the gates, insisting that Elizabeth and Marjorie aren't present. Despite their persistent denial, Elizabeth and Marjorie are caught by the king's men. Prince Edward orders Robert's brother Neil to be hanged from the castle gates. In a harrowing scene, Neil is disemboweled in front of Elizabeth and Marjorie. The prince then slays Lord Fraser's throat, giving the order to take Robert's wife and daughter as hostages back to England. Meanwhile, on the island, Robert receives word of Neil's execution and his family's capture, igniting a fiery desire for revenge within the Outlaw King. Returning to the mainland, he continues amassing resources and allies. Understanding the imbalance in forces, he realizes that engaging the English in direct combat would lead to inevitable defeat, given their overwhelming strength. The Scots opted for guerrilla warfare tactics, launching surprise attacks on English fortifications in small, tactical strikes. After defeating the garrison at his castle and setting it ablaze, Robert allows James Douglas to lead a similar assault. Douglas infiltrates his family's castle on Palm Sunday during Mass, catching the majority of the English garrison in prayer inside the church. Seizing the opportunity, Douglas and his men ruthlessly engage their enemies, setting fire to the castle before rallying more supporters for their cause and reuniting with Robert. King Edward receives the news about Robert's rebellious actions at the same time he grows increasingly aware of his declining health and frailty. Later, Marjorie is taken by a nun to serve as a quasi-hostage at a convent, while Elizabeth's parents are brought to her. Prince Edward II attempts to coerce Elizabeth into signing a document that renounces Robert, annuls their marriage, and pardons her for her crimes against the crown. When Elizabeth refuses and ridicules the prince for his failure to capture her husband, she's cruelly imprisoned in a metal cage suspended over the walls. Upon learning of another raid by Robert's forces, King Edward is enraged. Determined to personally quash the rebellion, reminiscent of his actions against William Wallace at Falkirk years ago, he musters his army and leads them into Scotland. However, during the march, King Edward falls ill and collapses. On his deathbed, he instructs his son to boil his body and carry his bones into every battle against the Scots. As he succumbs to dysentery, the prince's final words to his father express disdain, claiming his father's mistreatment stemmed from fear of his own strength. As Edward II exits his deceased father's tent, he orders his men to bury the late king's body, disregarding his father's final wish. Meanwhile, as the English draw nearer, Robert decides to confront them in a pitched battle instead of continuing to evade them. Despite his men's apprehensions, they put their trust in their king and prepare for the impending clash. They select a swampy battlefield and set up clever traps using ditches filled with sharpened stakes, with the intention of surprising the English heavy cavalry. James Douglas is assigned to intercept the prince and challenge them to battle at the chosen location. The following day, the two forces converge on the field, the English numbering in the thousands while Robert's army barely exceeds 500. Eager to solidify his claim as the new King of England, Edward II orders de Valence and numerous heavy cavalry to charge Robert's awaiting forces. The English realize the trap too late, falling victim to the stake-lined pits, resulting in a brutal, muddy confrontation. Even after Edward II joins the battle with his remaining men, the Scots continue to ruthlessly attack the English, forcing them into a hasty retreat. In the midst of the chaos, Robert and Edward II engage in a duel, with Robert emerging victorious, though battered. Despite Edward II's plea for aid, Robert spares him and allows him to withdraw with the remnants of his army. This triumph marked the Scottish king's first significant victory against the English. Angus MacDonald became the Lord of the Isles, and James Douglas became known as the Black Douglas and reclaimed his family's lands. Edward II returned to England and ascended the throne, only to be assassinated by his own nobles years later. Elizabeth eventually was released in a prisoner exchange and reunited with Robert and Marjorie. 3 centuries later, one of Robert's descendants, James VI, was crowned King of Scotland and England. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this.